Is that right? How about that? I used to go up to Blue Ridge when I was a kid to visit an aunt and uncle that had a country place out at, it was out from Blue Ridge, and there was name of some town there that I can't remember, but we'd get off the train in Blue Ridge and they'd come meet us, and we'd have to drive back somewhere into the hills. And I didn't want to go to the mountains. I wanted to go to the seashore, but they said, you are going to visit your aunt and uncle. They've invited you.
Okay,
We good? Okay.
I gotta get myself framed up.
All right.
Okay, tape is rolling.
Okay. If you would just please tell me your name and where you're from.
My name is Edith Harber Cook, Mrs. Earl Cook, and I'm from Atlanta.
How long have you been in Atlanta?
I was born in Atlanta and have lived out of Atlanta a number of times, but I'm back in Atlanta for good.
When did you join the military?
Well, after Pearl Harbor happened, everybody was so upset about the United States being attacked by the Japanese, and so there began to be news that they were going to also have some women's services. And I always liked the seashore and was hoping to get in, maybe into a Navy part of the Army, of the service. But the WACs came along first. They were called, at that time, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. And so they advertised that they were having women come out to Fort McPherson outside of Atlanta and apply to join the WACs. So I went out, much to my family's disgust. They did not want me to join the Army. But I went out there and I got interviewed, as did hundreds of other women from Georgia. And then they told us that it would be a while before we heard anything. So in the meantime, my family went down to St. Simon's for a vacation, and while I was down there, I got a telegram saying that I was to come back to Fort Mac for further interviews. So I had to catch the train, go back to Fort McPherson, and they interviewed a bunch of us again, and then they said it would be a while before we were notified whether we had been accepted or not. So back to St. Simon's we went. And so finally, a few weeks later, I received a telegram saying that I had been accepted for service in the Women's Army Corps, and that I would be receiving notice about when and where to report. So that was the beginning of it.
Before Pearl Harbor, tell me a little bit about your life.
Well, I had grown up in Atlanta when I was in high school, and during my college years. I went out of town for college, but Atlanta was home. And so I finally finished college, not finally, in fact, I finished in 3 years by working extra quarters and subjects and so forth. But I was teaching school in Fulton County, and I was at Evan P. Howell School out on Howell Mill Road. It's gone now, the school.
Tell me a little bit about the day, about December 7th, about where you were and what you were thinking when you heard about Pearl Harbor.
Our family attended St. Mark Methodist Church on Peachtree, so we drove in every Sunday to attend Sunday school and church. And after church, we went home, had lunch, and at that time there was a radio program on. I think it was Andre Kostelanetz and his orchestra. And I was in the living room listening on the radio to that program when they broke in with a news item, and they began telling about Pearl Harbor being attacked. And the family really were wondering what in the world was going to happen to the United States when that happened.
How did you feel?
How did I feel?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was upset that we were going to probably have to, the United States was going to have to definitely get in and fight the Japanese. And everybody was upset.
After you were accepted into the WACs, tell me a little bit about your enlistment process and your training and where you were stationed.
Well, as I said, we went out to Fort Mac to be questioned, and then we got those of us that were chosen got our orders to report for duty at Fort Des Moines, Iowa in late August. So, like I said, my mother was real upset. She was just sure I was going to be killed right away. But anyway, I convinced the family that was what I was going to do. I'd taught school 4 years. I was an adult, and I was going to join the Army. So the day that we were supposed to leave, everybody went to the Union Station in downtown Atlanta. It was near Rich's in those days. It's long gone. And while we were waiting to catch the train, all of a sudden my mother said, "Do you have a will?" And I said, "A what?" She said, "A will." And I said, "Not that I know of." She called a lawyer friend over and had me write out a will. She was just sure I was going to be killed the first week I was in service. But anyway, we finally got on the train, and a whole group of us from Georgia went up on the train. It went to Chicago, and then at Chicago we changed trains and went to Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And we were met with buses that took us to our barracks along the parade ground at Fort Des Moines. It resembled Fort McPherson a lot in that it had this beautiful parade ground and enlisted quarters on one side and officer homes on the other. Real nice looking fort. So we were assigned our places in the barracks, and I happened to be on the second floor, and they had these cots one right after the other, and had these little improvised closets that we could put some hanging clothes in, and at the foot of our cots we had trunks that we could keep our belongings in. So we were all ready to go for our basic training.
And what did basic training consist of?
Well, we had to take all kinds of courses about the Army, its rules, its regulations, its formations, and at that time we were being trained by Army officers, male Army officers, and some of those young men didn't appreciate having to work at a women's facility. But after a few weeks, they decided we weren't too bad, so they were very friendly and nice to us. And there were about 3 or 4 squadrons of us with a male commanding officer, and so we trained from late August to about October the 10th. And on October the 10th, we went to the auditorium that they had at Fort Des Moines, and Mrs. Hobby, who was Colonel Edith Cook Hobby, who was the one that thought of forming the WACs, she came out and made this speech at our graduation, and we were commissioned as, now in those days they called us, instead of second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, we were called third officers, second officers, first officers. But of course we were what you would call a second lieutenant when we were commissioned. So as soon as our graduation was over, various ones began getting orders to leave Fort Des Moines and be scattered around the country, particularly in Washington, D.C. And then others of us were assigned, well, we were moved from barracks over across to officer quarters, and we were working in training women coming in to be in the Women's Army Corps. And it began to be fall and winter in Fort Des Moines. And one week it went down to 20 below zero, and we Southern girls were cold. And when we went out, we'd have to we'd take a scarf and put it over our faces so we could breathe. It was so cold. And the minute we stepped outdoors, our eyes would water and we'd get ice on our eyelids and all, but somehow we survived, and finally it warmed up a little bit more at Fort Des Moines. So I was officer in a basic training group for a while.
What was the attitude of some of your classmates? Were they like you? Were they wanting to prove that women could do this?
Oh, they wouldn't have been in there if they hadn't wanted to be. I mean, you had to join, and they were the most enthusiastic women or girls. We thought we were girls then, from all over the country, and so it was an interesting experience meeting people from Maine to California and north to south.
During the time you joined up, a lot of other folks were joining up too. Did you have any other family members that signed up for the service?
No, no.
Well, after you were assigned to the basic training unit for a while, then what happened?
I got orders to go with what they call them detachments in the WACs, not companies, but detachments. And I received orders to go down to Camp Crowder, Missouri. It was way down in the southwest corner of Missouri, near Joplin, Missouri. The little town nearby was Neosha. And it was a huge, huge Signal Corps base. And they had about 4 different commands there. There was a headquarters command and a Signal Corps command and 2 or 3 other Signal Corps things, but more highly technical signal commands. And so we first were under the company commander. I mean the what would you call it? The camp general. But after a while, we got moved to another command. I mean, we stayed in the same place, but we were under another command.
Tell me a little bit about what your specific job was and
what my job was.
Yes, and what a typical day was like.
All right. They had a barracks area for the enlisted women and a dining room for everybody. I mean, for the enlisted women and officers. And then over across the street, there was this little building that we officers lived in called officers' quarters. And so we had to take, well, at that time I was, like I said, a 3rd officer, and I was 2nd in command. And so right away we started being real officers and soldiers. We'd have reveille, and we officers had to take turns holding reveille with our troops. And I wasn't used to getting up that early in the morning, but somehow I'd managed to get up and put on some clothes and dash over there to check the troops to see if they were all there. And then after we'd checked all the different ones, why, then they would be dismissed to go to breakfast, and we officers usually went back to the quarters and fell in our cots to get a little bit more sleep.
And how long were you a third officer?
They began calling us, instead of third, second, and all that, they began, like I said, calling us by Army titles like second lieutenant, first lieutenant, captain, and so forth. That was good. And so I, being second in command, I had certain duties to perform. And then after about a year, the commanding officer over our detachment was transferred, and they made me the company commander. And I didn't know how long that would be, but as it turned out, I stayed at Camp Crowder all during the rest of the war, and I was finally promoted to captain in the latter, well, in the middle or latter part of my Army career.
Did anything special happen on the base, or in your experience when everyone heard about the invasion of Normandy?
Oh yes, we were kept up with the news. Now, we didn't have TV and all that in those days, but every day they would put out a paper that would tell all that was going on in Europe and Pacific, and then we officers had to also call the women in. I forget how many times a week, but we would call them into the orderly room and tell them what was going on in the war, how it was progressing, were we winning or losing or whatever. So we were kept up with what was going on, and we had radios. I mean, I had one and could listen to it at night and sort of get an idea about how things were doing.
Tell me about how you kept in contact with your family while you were at Crowder.
Oh, we wrote letters, and our family were good about, most families were very good about writing letters. Mail call was very important in those days. We were so glad to hear from home. So that was the big time of the day, to receive mail from family and friends.
What else did you do in your spare time?
Well, fortunately, I had a car. My mother taught school back in Atlanta, but when summer came, after I'd been sent to to Camp Crowder, Missouri, I asked her, would she please drive my little car out so I'd have one. So she did, and she visited. She had not been very happy about my being in the Army, but she came out, drove out, and stayed about a week. And all the enlisted women and officers were so good to her that, oh, she just was all for it at that time. So I finally put her on the train, and she came back to Atlanta, and I had my car. And so I was able to, if any of us WAC officers were off at the same time, we'd try to take trips to places where we had time on weekends to drive. And I remember one time we drove down to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was the nicest town, and people down there just treated us beautifully. I mean, they were so friendly and nice to us. And other times, if we had enough time, we'd maybe catch the train. There was a train that went from Kansas City through Camp Crowder down to New Orleans. So one time, one of my officer friends and I decided we would go down and see New Orleans. Well, somewhere in the middle of Louisiana, the train stopped at a town, I forget what it was, and they told us that we had to get off because they needed to use that car as a troop train. So this whack friend and I got off with our baggage and had to wait for the next train. We didn't have time to go to New Orleans by then, so we just toured that city, whatever it was, I've forgotten now. And finally, when a train came back to take us to camp, we got on it and went on back to Camp Crowder.
Since you were military personnel on a military base, did any of the home front rationing affect you at all?
Did any of the what now?
Of the rationing, of the home front rationing?
No, it didn't really affect us. We had very good meals in our mess hall, and we had such a great mess sergeant that she would swap food items with some of the men mess officers. Those guys like to eat a lot of potatoes and things like that, and they didn't want some of these vegetables, so our mess officer would get food from the men and we'd give them some of ours, and so we really had delicious meals. Now, they weren't fancy and all that, but they were good meals.
Tell me a little bit about your feelings and the activities at Camp Crowder when word came through that the Germans were going to surrender.
If I remember correctly, everybody was supposed to stay on base until they could get off again. They didn't want too much carousing, I guess, in nearby towns. So, but we were so happy that part of the war was over, but here we were still faced with all that war out in the Pacific with the Japanese.
Well, tell me about that. Tell me about your experience with VJ Day.
Well, the minute evidently headquarters found out that the Japanese had surrendered, they immediately ordered that nobody could leave the post. Again, I think they did not want people to feel like that they could go out and hoop it up a lot. So we were just having to wait to hear what the effect of all this was going to be. Going back just a little bit, when the war was over in Europe, I happened to finally be on leave to go out to California to visit an aunt and uncle. I had wanted to visit them on a leave ever since I'd gone in the Army, and something would prevent it. But finally, in May, I was given leave of absence for about 2 weeks, and I caught a train and went to California and visited my aunt and uncle. And so when we heard that the war was over in Europe, we caught the train and went down to San Francisco. They lived up near Sacramento, and we took the train down to San Francisco to attend the big parade down Market Street in San Francisco. And I can remember everybody was so happy, but particularly men and women who were in service. We were just jumping up and down. I think by then we were about ready to go home, but still we had that war with Japan to put up with.
Did the fact that the VJ Day meant that all the fighting was over, did that make it more special than VE Day?
Oh yes, but like I may have mentioned, the minute that was announced, everybody was restricted to quarters because they didn't want everybody going out and raising Cain. So we had to stay on base for, as I remember, it's 2 or 3 days till things sort of calmed down and all the news was out about the war being over.
What effect? Well, actually, let me first ask Tell me about the end of the war and mustering out for you.
Of all things, I thought probably I had to wait a while to be out of the service, because I had to wait until all the women in my detachment had been discharged and sent home. And so, that happened to all the officers in our company, and the men officers too in their companies. So when things had gotten under control and most of the troops were gone, I finally was released, and so I had to drive my little car home. So I got another person that was going back to Georgia to ride with me, and so we drove from Camp Crowder, Missouri back to Atlanta, and I left my car at home. But of all things, instead of being discharged at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, where I'd gone in, they sent me to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I had to be up there a few days going through all the discharge business. So finally, when they were through with me up there, I caught the train and went back to Atlanta, and I was a civilian again.
Did you make any really good friends in the service?
Oh, yes. When the war was over, two of the ladies that had been in my detachment decided to put out a newspaper about twice a year and encouraged officers and enlisted women to write and tell what they were doing as civilians. So for a number of years we looked forward to that, and then they got tired of editing it. They were getting up in years. They were two of the older women in the detachment, and so somebody else took it over and kept the news up. But as the years went by, a lot of them began to be sick, or a number of them died, and so there got to be less and less news. And finally it got down to the point where one of the enlisted women, who had been a younger woman in those days, she took it over, and she tried to write a newsletter at least once a year. And she hadn't written one in about a year or so now, because it seems like nobody keeps in touch with her. So I'm afraid a lot of them are gone now.
What effect did World War II have on your life?
Well, I think it, you associated with so many different kind of people and so many different circumstances. I think it made you a person with a broader outlook, and I wouldn't take anything for having served. Like I mentioned, it was not fun all the time, but I am so glad that I did serve in the Women's Army Corps.
Do you think that, let me rephrase that. Tell me your thoughts on how women being accepted into the military for the first time on a large scale, and women taking jobs in factories, affected society after the war.
Well, definitely it gave women a chance to do things that they had never been able to do before, not only military service, but Rosie the Riveter that we had to hear a lot about, women working in factories and airplane factories. They were building planes here in Atlanta, out there at Marietta, and so it really gave women a chance to go out and take jobs that they had never had before.
Do you think that carried over and remained sort of a permanent fixture in post-war society?
Oh yes, they go out and take more jobs than they ought to now. It bothers me a little bit that so many women went to work and leave they have children, marry and have children, and yet they go off into their careers and leave the kids to sometimes shift for themselves or be with a nurse or something like that. I think it has some drawbacks.
What are some of the larger effects and consequences on the nation as a whole from World War II?
Well, we won the war, and I think we began probably maybe trading with countries more and traveling to countries more than people had in the past. So I think in earlier days only the rich men and women could travel to Europe and Asia and places like that. So then also here came the airplane, and you can travel so much more conveniently now, although I still love to ride a train if I can.
Tell me why it was necessary to fight the war.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Tell me why you think it was necessary that we fight the war.
Because we were attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. And so we had to get in there and protect ourselves.
Again, this is the time where you can speak your mind on what you want future generations to know and to remember about the war years. Just tell me what you hope carries on to future generations.
Well, I would hope they would teach more American history than they seem to be teaching now. From what I hear from my grandsons and daughters, there's not much American history, ancient history. I mean, back when we were being formed, became the United States and all. And I've said often that I think that this is just a personal opinion, but with so many of these young people just living it up and dropping out of school and all that, I just think that when they get to the high school age, if they drop out of high school or graduate from high school, I think it'd be well to put them in military training for about a year or two and let them learn what it's all about, taking orders and serving their country and things like that, and not have any 4Fs. If they claim that they have some physical disability, then train them in something that they can do, but not let them get off the hook and keep jobs and things like that some of them pulled on us in World War II.
Do you think the sacrifices made during the war were worth it?
Yes, we had to defend ourselves. If we'd let the Japanese continue on and come over here to the United States and fight us, why, this would have been a different country.
You've mentioned defending the United States against the Japanese. Just from your perspective, do you or did you consider the Japanese to be a greater threat than the Germans?
I don't think I ever thought about that. But certainly once they attacked us, why, we thought they were worse than the Germans, I guess.
Tell me your thoughts about the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Well, we were just overjoyed when we found out about it, because we realized that after that happened, that surely the war would come to an end and we could all go home. By then, we had seen our duty and we had done it, and having been away from home for 3 or 4 years, we were ready for peacetime and to get back to normal living wherever we were going to live.
Just one more question. In a nutshell, what do you think is the legacy of World War II?
I don't know that I have any particular opinion about the legacy. We did save the world at that time, I think, for the United States, but I don't really have any deep thoughts about the legacy.
Is there anything that we haven't covered or that you would like to say at this point?
I'm just proud that I was able to go in, and I met some wonderful friends, and we have continued to be friends through the years. There are 3 women that were in my OCS class at Fort Des Moines, and we continue to write each other. One lives in New Hampshire. One lives down at St. Simon's Island. She was originally from Macon, but she lives at St. Simon's. And one that was from Canton, Georgia, lives out in Joplin, Missouri, which was near the camp where I spent the war. But that friend went out on recruiting duty early in her WAC career, and she met a Navy man, and they got married, and then she, when she was expecting a baby, she had to get out of the service. So we've kept our friendship up, and about 3 or 4 years ago, they had a reunion at Fort Des Moines for any WACs who had ever trained there. And so we 3 friends went to that reunion, and we had the best time meeting other women who had served in World War II and had trained at Fort Des Moines. And they entertained us highly. A hotel sponsored that. One of the old hotels in Des Moines had been renovated, and they wanted to have something that would that they could celebrate and call attention to the new hotel. So they invited us. Any women who had trained at Fort Des Moines could come and be their guest at the hotel, and they had programs for us. And one of the things they did was take us down by bus one day to the bridges of Madison County, and that movie had come out about the bridges of Madison County. So we went down, and we had the best time seeing where that movie had been made and hearing about Clint Eastwood and that leading lady that was in there. So we were sort of disappointed that more former WACs that were not able to attend, but like I said, so many have died, or they are up in age and they have physical problems and they weren't able to come. But those of us that went, we just had a really good time reminiscing about our days in the Women's Army Corps.
I did think of one more question I'd like to ask you. Give me your thoughts on the significance of the contribution that the WACs made during the war.
We won it. Oh, I think they really contributed a lot to think they could. The men didn't particularly like being replaced and sent overseas, but we were able to hold down jobs that would release more men for active duty on the either in Europe or the Pacific. So I can't say the men particularly appreciated that, but anyway, it was that was just the way it was, and so we were glad to be there helping out.
All right, I think that's all we need. Okay.
I won the war again, Earl.
Thank you so much.
Beg pardon?
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
I even got you out of here just before lunch. So,
What a coincidence. Oh, me. Those